Good morning for those watching in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And it's my honor to welcome today the Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourová. This is an event co-organized by the Future Europe Initiative and the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. As you know, the relationship with the European Union is central the purpose and mission of the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council was founded on the idea that the United States is stronger with its allies, that it's a greater asset, greatest asset, especially in a time of crisis, in a time of great power competition. In this respect, the strength, unity, and resilience of the European Union is a key national interest of the United States. Uh, Commissioner Vice President Jourová's portfolio strikes at the heart of many of our programs, many of our content. The Future Europe Initiative works obviously on the future of European Union, transatlantic digital issues and the rule of law, and the Digital Forensics Research Lab on identifying, explaining, and countering disinformation in the digital engagement space. And this is why I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague Graham Brookie, the director of DFR Lab, to conduct this conversation. Vice President Jourová, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Before I turn to you, let me just give a few ground rules. We're here on Zoom. This conversation is live streamed also on our social media platform, on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Please ask us questions by writing them down in the Q&A box on Zoom, or just by asking us questions on Twitter by responding to the Atlantic Council Twitter account that is live streaming this conversation. Uh, Vice President Jourová, but before we turn to the questions of rule of law, which are obviously central to your work and portfolio, I want to ask you a broader question and ask you how you assess the European Union's performance and response to this crisis. We've heard early assessments that there were divisions. Obviously, the Commission has reacted since then. What is your view on the EU's response to COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, good morning to United States. Indeed, we have afternoon here. I want to thank for your invitation, and I always appreciate the possibility to discuss with the people from the other side of the Atlantic, because we have so many things in common, European Union and the United States, and it's always useful to have an exchange of views on how I see the reaction of the EU. We had a slow start, as everywhere else. Nobody predicted this to come, and although our agency, the European Center for Diseases Monitoring, already in January announced or warned that the coronavirus could move to European Union, there was a very slow reaction from all sides. So now I have to say that Europe is back. We are doing the right things at the level of the member states. There is already solidarity between the member states. There is already coordination on the level of the EU. We have a very intensive communication with the relevant ministers and, of course, with the prime ministers. You know, EU is 27 countries which were affected all. So, for instance, we could not trigger the traditional civil protection mechanism, which works on the basis of some countries affected, some not. So not affected countries help those who are in troubles. This could not be used because all the countries were affected. So we have symmetric impact, and it will have asymmetric consequences on different states, on different regions, different sectors, different layers of society. And so now we work on the proper response. First of all, to win the fight against coronavirus. That's we are mobilizing all the forces to manage that, but also to come with proper decisions regarding the economic recovery. because I deeply believe that the coronavirus will be gone, will be killed, but the economic consequences of it will live with us. And we need to guarantee that the time for necessary recovery will be as short as possible. We are working on the budget. We are working on inventing new ways of financing the new needs. We are working on so many fronts. We are working on the proper mechanisms for reopening the borders, because we need to renew Schengen regime in the EU. We need to renew the full functioning of the freedoms we have in Europe, and this requires joint forces. And I think maybe I'm over optimistic, but I always like to see a positive plan, and we have a positive plan ahead of us.
We have a positive plan, and you mentioned symmetric impact and symmetric consequences. Obviously, this is something we could also say in the transatlantic space between the European Union and the United States. Vice President Jourová, you're one of the strongest voices on the question of rule of law and liberal democracy in Europe. At the outset of this crisis, you warned that killing the virus was not kill democracy. And so I want to ask you about some of the issues that we've seen arise that were already there before. Obviously, concerns over emergency measures that were taken in Hungary to respond to this crisis. And recently, the Commission also lodged its fourth rule of law infringement against Poland. I want to ask you, what are the next steps? What are you concerned about regarding these two countries for the European Union?
I have to say at the beginning that the Commission is supporting all the member states in the same way to win the battle against corona crisis. So we are fully with Polish and Hungarian people. We are supporting the governments in what they are doing against the health crisis. But at the same time, we see emergency regimes launched in majority member states, and the emergency measures and regimes have to keep some balance and some conditions. If I may say it in a very simplified way, emergency regime does not mean that you switch off your constitution, that you totally liquidate the civil freedoms, that you are silencing the media, that you are silencing the parliaments, that you are a kind of taking the decisions which are not relevant for solving the health crisis, and so we are looking at the emergency measures in the member states through this set of standards. And indeed, in Hungary, we identified some problematic parts and issues, especially the not defined the deadline for the emergency regime, not very clear oversight from the side of the parliament, the problematic criminal law, which can punish or sanction those who deliver or produce of so-called fake news. And I said clearly that we will follow and we will monitor how the emergency regime is applied in Hungary. I do it on everyday basis. I have now very good overview. Nobody can accuse me that I am taking decisions from Brussels without the knowledge of what's happening in the country. I am also in contact with the official, of course, authorities. And Mr. Orbán announced the end of the emergency regime for I think next week. So we will see what will happen.
And I wanted to ask you also about Poland, obviously, as the Commission launched its fourth rule of law infringement, and there's been controversies about the postponement of the presidential election there.
With both with Poland and Hungary, we have a so-called procedure under Article 7. It's yes, I am a lawyer, so I'm sorry, just to explain what Article 7. It's the article in the Lisbon Treaty, which I believed we would never trigger it, because it can be used when we analyze properly and deeply and come to a conclusion that there is a systemic breach of the rule of law in the country. And it's the case of Poland because we were watching with big concerns the reform of judiciary system, which, according to our assessment, is diminishing and threatening the independence of judges and of the courts. And so we launched not only Article 7, but also several infringement procedures because we saw the laws in Poland which were in breach with European laws. And we are winning the cases. We, as the Commission, we are winning the cases which are decided by the European Court of Justice. And this is the process which I would really like to see an end of. And we need the proper debate with the Polish authorities. Of course, we have to continue the legal procedures. It's our obligation. But I would really like after Corona to come back to around the table with the Polish authorities and discuss the way forward. And the rule of law issues, for me, this is a personal case. Before we started, I told you that I have a long CV. I was born in 1964. So the first memory in my life are the Soviet tanks in 1968 in my country, in Czechoslovakia. And what followed, the occupation by the army and the so-called normalization, no freedom of speech, no independent courts, no civil society activity. The regime wanted the people to be just disciplined and once in 4 years to come to the so-called elections, which were not free and fair at all. So I know exactly what I don't want to happen in the EU. Because when we joined the Central and East European countries, when we joined the EU, I was so relieved because I understood that the EU will kind of guarantee that we will not slip back to the regime of restricted and limited freedoms. And so for me, this is personal case, and I have to be also professional, and I have to do my best to fulfill the legal obligations we have. So for me, this is a difficult task, but I honestly believe that we have to do everything to invite Poland and Hungary back to European Union and to have guaranteed that in those two countries the rule of law functions and can survive.
I think what you just said really strikes at the heart of the core values of what animates our work here also at the Atlantic Council. Before turning to my colleague Graham Brookie, let me ask you just the last question on also another very newsy item, and speaking to the lawyer, there's been a controversial decision made by the German Constitutional Court recently on the ECB's, the European Central Bank's bond purchasing program. I don't want to ask you so much about the economic consequences it can have on the ECB, but more on the question of what it means for the rule of law in Europe and the tensions between some states asserting their sovereignty over the EU jurisdiction.
At this moment, I have to confirm that we are still analyzing the judgment and that we will take a position later from the legal point of view. But already now I can tell you that if there is how to say, if the EU should work well, the EU has to rely on some very steady pillar, somebody who has the last word, and is the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And without the pillar, I cannot imagine how we could continue, because then the reference point, if it disappears, we would be in a very difficult situation. And also the primacy of the EU law has been recognized for decades in the EU. So there are the basic principles, including also the independence of the European central bank. So these principles have to remain untouched. And so at this moment, I can only repeat that we still believe that these principles have to be maintained, and we will work further on some legal position of the Commission, which I cannot reveal to you now.
We could have had a scoop.
With full respect to the decision of the National Court. Yeah, so this is a delicate exercise, and we have to be careful, but we have also to understand all the possible consequences of this judgment and be able to go through that somehow. Absolutely. Successfully.
Madam Vice President, on my part, thank you so much for the important work that you're doing, and thank you for joining us. Let me pass it to my colleague, Graham Brookie, the Director of the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council.
Thanks so much, Ben. And for everybody that's joined us online, I just want to take a quick second to say, don't hesitate to send your questions. This is a conversation as opposed to a presentation. And so if you've joined us on Zoom, there's a chat function. If you're following on Twitter or Facebook, don't hesitate to ask questions in the comments. We have staff at the Atlantic Council that are looking at those comments, and we'll try to get to them here at the end of our conversation. But first, back to you, Madam Vice President. You've long been a leading voice from the efforts by governments to combat disinformation. And now we're experiencing what the World Health Organization termed back in February an infodemic, which they define as an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that leads to the wider public struggling to find that accurate information. And so how does that phenomena that is happening in parallel to the pandemic, has that changed your approach with disinformation? Has that lended more urgency to efforts? How has that changed the ongoing efforts that you've led at the EU?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. How much time do we have? This is very, very long story. I will try to do it short. The COVID crisis. In my view, it's a game changer in many ways, and it has a strange feature that it amplifies all the good things and all the bad things which we already had before. And when we discuss about digital sphere and internet and the technologies, there are so many good things we can use now. We can harvest the advantage of the distant communication, and it's a miracle, and it shows that that there is a very, very strong positive feature. The negative features, among other things, are illegal content and harmful content, which is so easily spread on internet in the platforms. I had several very serious debates with my partners in the United States. I remember Jeff Sessions, who was kind of mentoring me that you in Europe, you are prohibiting content. We are in the United States fully respecting the freedom of speech. And we spoke about hate speech, which is on the blacklist in the criminal codes in all the member states of the EU, for a very good reason, because free speech cannot to protect free speech. It doesn't mean that we will excuse the speech which can incite real violence and which invites for killing and doing real harm to real people. So coming back to COVID situation. Indeed, we have an avalanche of disinformation and fake news spread in online world. We had to identify what we want the people to read first, to have the access to trustworthy information, because now we live in a period when to read and to have access to the truth, authorized truth by health authorities. I speak about health. it might be the way how to save health and lives. So we have an agreement with the platforms that they will give priority and sufficient space to authoritative content from the WHO and from the ministries of health, and to remove dangerous disinformation and fake news which might cause harm to health and security. This is exceptional because we never wanted anything to be removed. We always wanted to work with facts and figures and with the arguments, and this is new, but we are doing this for a very good purpose. COVID is an exceptional situation which requires exceptional measures, but we would like to come back to a kind of old normal and find a way how to regulate internet in relation to illegal content, which is in European conditions: hate speech, child pornography, terrorist content, extremism, and these sort of things, and how to find a way how to diminish the impact of disinformation. And we will intensively work to have this done by the end of this year. So speaking about regulation, speaking about legislation, but also non-legislative actions.
So two very interesting threads to pull on a little bit further. So the new European Commission is currently setting its agenda, and you've indicated that you will continue efforts to hold platforms accountable, to include working on furthering the code of practice and things of that nature. And so one of the balances is working with the social media companies. Another is a balance of working across all of the member states. And so how do you see the kind of coordination with not only social media companies in terms of regulation, as they've shown more willingness in the context of coronavirus to upgrade accurate content or content that is deemed accurate and remove more content than they've typically been willing to moderate. But also we see, to a point that you and Ben had talked about a bit ago, is this some of the efforts by specific member states to draft their own regulations. And so what is the balance there, and how do you see both of those kind of dual heads of coordination, both with member states and with the platforms?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will start with the second one. Well, yes, I will be concrete. In Germany, there is the law which already imposes legal liability on the platforms for taking measures or for proactive working against the hate speech. This is what I didn't want for Europe, because I still think that in case of doubt, the speech, the hate speech should be left online because we protect the freedom of speech. But in Germany, the law works somehow quite well, according to both the ministers and the platforms. In France, they adopted the Avia law. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and I spoke to French authorities about some possible amendments even before they adopted the law. We have to look into more precisely. It's Germany, it's France. There might be some other states introducing the rules, and we should stop this fragmentation in the EU. That's why I said that by the end of the year, we will propose the pan-European solution. And I will hope we will attract all the member states to come along with us and to adopt the legislation and coherent with the European solution. Fragmentation is not good for European business, if I may be a little bit pragmatic, because for Google and Facebook, if we are so naive and if I may say, even stupid, and we have different laws in different member states, they will manage because they have an army of lawyers. They can adapt to every single national set of rules. But we want the smaller companies to operate on the so-called digital single market in Europe. So we would like for digital world to keep the principle of, or to introduce the principle of one continent, one law. And this is what we did with GDPR. Yeah, it is exactly the case. So fragmentation is not good for the EU. We will work hard to come with European regulation and convince the member states to agree on the unified or equal model. How we work with the member states, we have several lines, several sets of partners. Of course, member states have deployed the capacities to fighting against disinformation. It's usually a Ministry of Interior or Home Affairs, or Ministry of Defense, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We also have the so-called rapid alert system, which might be triggered in case there is some really dangerous coordinated attack on Europe from outside. And you know that disinformation is somehow already included under the so-called hybrid threats. So for this reason, we have this rapid alert system. We also work with the national authorities organizing the elections, because we didn't want last year the European elections to be affected by disinformation. So we worked intensively with the member states, and we came with a set of rules. And last but not least, also we work with the consumer organizations, because there is an increase of very immoral kind of offers to the consumers, the products to save your life in Corona time. Price gouging is very, very frequent. So also this is the bottom line. So we work in a triangle: the Commission, the platforms, and these national authorities. And this is up to now, I have to say, very intensive and quite fruitful cooperation.
Completely understood. One of the topics that you touched on is fragmentation. And it's clear that disinformation is a collective challenge that involves government and media and tech, and doesn't necessarily respect the terms of service of one platform or the national borders of one country. And so a topic that I'd like to turn to is foreign influence. And that many times gets conflated. Disinformation doesn't necessarily equal foreign influence, and foreign influence doesn't necessarily equal disinformation. But recently, on the topic of foreign influence, there were reports that China tried to soften a report regarding COVID-19 disinformation deriving from the EU. And so, how do you work to speak with one voice from the EU and not essentially be pressured by a number of member states that might be predisposed, noting that the geopolitical relations with a country like China are extremely delicate and extremely important?
We have ahead of us serious discussions with the member states to reflect what is happening and what was happening in the Corona times. And indeed, the production or the delivery of disinformation from Russia and also increasingly from China was intensified. I could repeat, but I will not do it. A set of the most frequent messages which were spread in the EU, and this is for a serious talk with the member states, and this is for intensifying of the cooperation of the triangle which I spoke about before. We decided not to respond on propaganda, which is using fake news and manifestly clear lies and dangerous lies by to react on it by the same thing. We will always use facts and figures and arguments. It's not easy because according to our research and many surveys, lying flies 7 times quicker than the truth. Lying is so bloody sexy. Truth is for many boring. Also, to my regret, lying is selling better online. Yeah, so this is one of the debates, or the topics for our debates is the platforms that to monetize lying online. It's immoral and it should not continue. So there are many factors which make our task very difficult. But we have to continue. We will also increase the capacities for the fight against disinformation. COVID is a lesson, and before COVID crisis. We identified several topics or themes which were in a very which were frequently covered by disinformation. It was migration, minorities, environment, health, security issues, and increasingly green. I mentioned environment before, but green policies, and now we have amplified the health issue, and this is too serious. We really needed to act, but again, what I said before, we have to find systemic measures which will not kill the freedom of speech in the EU, but which will efficiently address this issue. And that's for the work of not only for me, but also for Joseph Borrell, who is my main partner in the Commission to address this issue.
Understood. And I very much appreciate your description of different types of disinformation content as sexy and engaging. I don't think that we hear that very often from policymakers, and it's absolutely true.
Well,
one term
yeah, I am sometimes criticized very much when I say that lying is not illegal. And rightly so. The lawyers sometimes sound cynical, and so I have to add, lying is not illegal, but it's immoral and should not be tolerated. So let's be smart in designing the tools against that, because the freedom of speech should really be our priority to protect the freedom of speech. We have to be very careful in defining what is disinformation, which should be which we should focus on in our actions. Facts belong to everybody. The opinions are personal. So these kind of things have to be considered.
One of the terms from policymakers in the United States is speech, but not reach. You might be entitled to specific items of speech, but not necessarily entitled to reaching huge amounts of audience.
I love American English because you have the way to say simply what I needed 5 minutes to explain it.
Well, and we don't even have a rhyming language either. One last question, and we'll take this one from the audience, but it picks up on one of the kind of key themes that we've been discussing is how do you kind of address the differences of a collective challenge of information between foreign influence and domestic? And so one way that I would paraphrase that is it's very easy for us to get up in democratic nations in the morning and say, oh, well, we're definitely against foreign influence and disinformation from foreign actors in our countries. But it's much more difficult to address the domestic disinformation that occurs that erodes democracy just as much. And so how do you see that balance, and how do you see the levers that you have at the EU in addressing both?
Well, it's absolutely a good question, because you you touched upon one of the biggest difficulties, because in many cases we are not able to identify where is the origin of the disinformation. Of course, our experts tried to identify. In many cases, they managed. It was especially the case of the pro-Kremlin sources, which not only produced it but also managed to distribute it in the EU. By the way, with different strategy for different member states. Mm-hmm. That's also one of the features of the disinformation, that they are always well designed on what will fly with domestic audience, and there is always a little portion of truth and then big bulk of lie, and so it's not always possible and always easy to identify whether it was produced outside, imported in Europe, and distributed by the proxies which live in the EU. We have our own production in the EU, and for me this is a bigger headache, by the way, because we here it is very uneasy to identify who is behind the disinformation and fake news, and to make it even more difficult, we have to be really careful not to start defining those who produce the fake news, those who just are critical or have opinion. And this is what makes me nervous about some of the emergency regimes now, coming back to Hungary, that there is the law against fake news, and the people who were critical as the government were accused of committing a crime. So you know, this is a very complicating one of the complicating features of disinformation and our ability to act on this. So now on the 10th of June we will come with the action plan on fighting against disinformation, and there will be a prominent place for the text referring to the freedom of speech and the need to keep free the space for criticism and for unpleasant comments, which the politicians might not like. But you can imagine how many fake news are circulating about myself, but I have to be able to live with it as a politician.
Completely understood. And I think that this is a perfect conversation to draw together all of the portions of your portfolio, from the rule of law to and all issues related to transparency to democracy, but also this online disinformation space that are directly related and in some cases causal, which I think your answer goes directly to. And so this ties directly into our mission and remit at the Atlantic Council. We're so glad that you could join us today. We know that you're incredibly busy and have way too much to think about in the context of not only coronavirus, but also the online information space and democracy writ large. To your point on the June 10th updates to a number of the policies, we'd love to have you back to talk in depth about all of those elements. In the meantime, good luck. We're rooting for you. We're working with you. And democracy obviously is not a team sport, and so we'll keep at it. And obviously on all of these collective challenges, we're here to help. So thank you so much for taking the time today. Thanks to everybody who joined us online, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.
Thank you. It will be my pleasure. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. You do the same.